Welcome to a new episode of the Creative Industry Insight podcast. I'm your host, Bobby. Today, we welcome cinematographer Anna Franquesa-Solano, who joins us to talk about their work on Prime Video's Expats. Anna will talk us through the creative decisions she made to help craft the look of the show. Please be warned that there are heavy spoilers in this episode. Now let's jump into the conversation with Anna. Hi Anna, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm excited to sit down to talk about Amazon Prime's new show Expats, which at the time of recording hasn't had its final episode, but once it's released, the finale would have aired. And yeah, I'm excited to sit down and talk to you about the show. I feel like Amazon on a slight roll at the moment of their TV shows with what they're releasing with this, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, Reacher. It feels like they're kind of slowly stepping up to being taking over the mantelpiece from like Netflix and all the other streamers of being a good place to catch shows. I still think Apple might be the ones that are edging it, but yeah, Amazon are close following by.
Yeah, they are definitely investing on that.
Yeah, and then it's also you get to see different, especially with expats, like different corners of the world and stories are from different parts of the world. But I guess with something like expats, like how did the project come about for you, and what was it what made you want to take it on? Was it a case that Lulu just called you up saying we're bringing the band back together, want you to come back on board, and work with you again?
Well, after the farewell, we became close friends with Lulu, so we are always in touch and we kind of discuss possible projects, and yeah, we keep each other posted on the options. So it was kind of clear that we were gonna do something together with also Young, the production designer. We're the three of us, a pretty close trio. And so it was just more a matter of which project. And it turned out to be Expats.
What was it in when you're reading the script that made you sort of be like, wow, this is going to be something really interesting to tackle? Because like with, when you're reading it, it's like, do you read it a number of times and then begin your research in how you want to create the look in the show? Or do you read it once and then just have something in your mind that you know that you're going to look at specific films or photographers as inspiration?
So because we're very close with Lulu, she always shares drafts and working process. So I'm actually working or I have it in my head, the project right way before pre-production. So I find that also very liberating because there's no pressure there. I can just like throw in ideas or inspirations um, to her while the writing process. Like one of my my favorite interactions that we had during that process was when while she was in the writer's room. I kind of ran into randomly to an exhibition of photographer Michael Wolf, whose work is incredible, and he has some series inspired like in based in Hong Kong. And one of them I find particularly interesting. It's a very in-depth study of like all the cleaning tools that decorate Hong Kong alleys, and it's just an incredible collection of images that I saw and shared with Lulu, and she obviously really liked it, and she was able to incorporate that into the narrative of the script, and it turned into what we call the mob formation, which is the subtle connection between Margaret and Wen on episode 5, which I just think it's an interesting way of how to incorporate a visual inspiration into the narrative, even though it's a subtle storyline, it's a subtle detail. So, I mean, and you were talking more in general, like all the inspiration. So we created, during pre-production, we created a huge visual wall of photography. We had a lot of photography inspirations, like Christopher Anderson. One was, some of his photos were really important for our mood boards, and that, for example, inspired like the haircut of Margaret. It's inspired by one of his photographies, and then we also watch a bunch of movies. In this case, because we shot the project during COVID, we had to quarantine for an excessive amount of days, and we were 3 weeks locked in a hotel room. So every night we would watch a movie together and discuss it and do some research. Like, it was the perfect setup actually to do that in a very relaxed way. And for some of the movies that we watch many, but one that we like to refer to was A White Day. It's a movie from Hilnur Palmason. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. And it is, I mean, I think it's an incredible movie, but it also it was an interesting example on how to find the right tone, because the events in the book and in the show are very tragic. So it was very important for us to not fall into over dramatizing and melodrama. So that was we had a lot of discussions on how to achieve that and stay away, but still being able to connect and express the drama that the characters are going through.
Always asking research what research I guess does for the show that they're working on, or the film that they're working on, is always one of my favorite questions to ask. Not because it's just one of those things where when people start mentioning things that they were looking into, that would then in my mind spark me like, yeah, of course, if you're shooting here, you're going to be looking at these certain films. But then also with the answers that the guests give, when you mention photographers, then that sort of afterwards I go and start Googling to then start looking at their work, and then sort of comparing it to what's been done on the show, in Expats, for example, and then just being like, oh, I know exactly what they were going for here. And that's always sort of my favorite thing to look at. I guess having the scripts quite early on is a great advantage for you guys, because you know what the scene is going to entail and what's going to come out of it. Of course, there's things that are going to change later on, because it's just one of those things that happen when you're making a TV show or film, that there's always changes in script and scenes, little things that added in, or in the detail, or more dialogues added in to beef up the scene. I guess as well, when you're in quarantine, you're pretty much going to have that more, as you said, relaxed atmosphere of, you can have your day, you could do what you need to do in your smart area, and then end it at the end of the day with a film, and start making notes of what you want to watch and what you're seeing as well. But I think as well with like research, do you find that sort of the process is quite fun to do, or do you find that you get to work on what you want to do and you just want to get out there and shoot as soon as possible?
I really enjoy that part of the process, because everything is still possible. You're just dreaming about it and brainstorming, and obviously I enjoy shooting, but that comes with its own stress and logistics, and this part, it's only about storytelling, and yeah, so it feels a lot more fun too, in the sense you're just alone with the director, or it depends on the part of the process, right? Or with production, with at the different stages. You are up more people on the team, but it is where everything, you create the visual language and everything comes together. So maybe the most creative moment of the process. So I do really enjoy it.
Yeah, and you kind of get that blank canvas, right? And then you start adding when you start talking about in pre-production having big wall of photos and other elements as well.
Yeah,
Um,
that felt actually my piece of art, like that big wall. I was very sad when we took it down.
yeah, and I can imagine that being sad though because you've worked so hard to create this and you've had these images in your head or an idea, but then also it kind of builds up and it has so much more meaning to you about, oh, this is exactly what we wanted to do for episode 2. This is what we want to do for episode 3, and this is
Hmm.
the big wide that we want to be using as well. But again, as all projects come to an end, you need to take things down. But in the show as well, Hong Kong as a city plays a big part. My wife worked out in Hong Kong, so she's quite interested to watch the show and see if there's places that she used to go to in terms of like bars or areas. And she always
Hmm.
it's kind of been quite nice to watch it with her and get those sort of tidbits of information and get an idea of what it's like. But we see cities like New York and London romanticized in film and TV. But as a cinematographer, how do you go about capturing the city and making it feel like a character in itself?
We didn't want to romanticize Hong Kong just because it feels like the story calls for something more grounded. And capturing Hong Kong kind of comes with a little bit of pressure because it's the place with such iconic visuals. Wong Kar-wai, I mean, it's just very strong imagery. So that was a little bit overwhelming at the beginning because yeah, it comes with that pressure, but I'm then you start just working on the script and everything kind of falls in place because you're just telling a very specific story. So the way we approach it was we went Lulu, young production designer, and I for a director scout, and we spent some time in the city um researching and understanding the geography of it, who lives where, which because every neighborhood in Hong Kong has its own character, like in any other city, but it just feels like it's very distinct there. So we wanted to depict the city accurately and not only showcase like the iconic places. So we really explored that. And for example, like the book refers to some specific locations, and we decided not to be restricted to those limitations and just find what we felt right for each character or scene. And like, for example, Margaret and Hillary in the book, they live in a town called Repulse Bay, which is expats total complete like bubble of expats, which is like maybe I don't remember 10-20 minute drive from Hong Kong. And it's the first place we went and it didn't feel right. It just felt out of context. It just felt a resort beach that could be anywhere and not really fancy. Like it had just a cheap quality to it, at least in the details in the apartments, in like the. So we thought the camera wouldn't read it correctly, so we decided to change to the Peak, which is a neighborhood in the mountains, on the top of the mountains that look over Hong Kong Island and Kowloon. So that was obviously a visual decision. Also, like it was a way to still separate like the two worlds quite distinctly, right? Because you kind of have to drive up this curved, winding road in order to get up to those luxury houses. And it introduces also an element that I wish it was more there, but of the jungle the green lush of the mountains surround Hong Kong, which I think it's very unique, and playing a lot with the contrast between these two worlds, which are the expats bubble, and which is not only the peak, but central, all their neighborhoods, with the more classic, gritty Hong Kong, which it's Mercy is the character who opens the door to that world in the show.
I think it's fascinating to hear how there's certain things that you want to change from the book to the screen. Obviously, like when it comes to adapting a book, you kind of want to be faithful to it, but then also it's always going to be different to what it's read on paper to what you see and what you want to make it interesting as well. And those sort of little changes that you would make. I think you touched upon about like the visual language of the show and the different use of spaces. I think that's another thing that's always as a audience member to see is like the sort of visual language that you want to be brought into the sort of different nooks and crannies of the city and the way that people live. I think with this show, when you're talking about the expats world where everything is quite big and a bit very glamorous, whilst then as you're talking about Mercy's world where it's very cramped, it's very small, and then but then it gets even more cramped when you go to Essie's world where they're all sort of on cardboard boxes sitting around one another, sort of just chit-chatting and catching up. I think that when you look at those worlds visually, I feel like you've done a really good way of like capturing of just how different people live and how spaces could also show how they're feeling at the same time. So with expats, where it's very everything's so big, and like, but they feel so empty about how they feel. Whilst with like Essies, they're all sort of all together, but they're sort of tight knit and they're all sort of all together. You can really feel that sort of sense of community amongst themselves.
Yeah, I mean the Hong Kong real estate is kind of crazy. So I think it's the second most expensive square feet in the world after Monaco. So the density of the city is incredible. And the contrast between the extremes of who can afford what, it's more extreme. So that was something we wanted to be able to express. And during all this research that I told you, we went into so many expats houses and we saw so many of those tiny rooms, because a lot of these expats houses are built already, like all the layouts have these tiny rooms either in the back or in the downstairs or in the basement for the helpers. It is a very much like it's part of the system. It's very much integrated in the way the city works. And we were very impressed. Some of them are actually closets. And yeah, the architectural element of all these spaces, we discussed a lot. I love to play with those elements in the visuals, and with production designer Young, that was always something that we were discussing on how to make it very prominent. And for example, Mercy's apartment, she would probably, with her lifestyle, she would probably have to share an apartment, not even live alone. We were not interested in that because we wanted to have a privacy, like the privacy. But the layout of that apartment, I think it's very interesting because it really gives you that sense of claustrophobia, or maybe like I always thought of it as it's an apartment that it's a result of dividing an apartment in three. So it's just a hallway that leads to a bathroom, and it's the only way to get to the bedroom, which is super strange. And playing with those elements, and I think we do a lot, mostly on episode 4, because it's all about those enclosed spaces. So yeah, those were elements that we were always excited to explore.
I think when you look at those sort of elements as well, I guess it also comes down to the production design and seeing what you see in real life to then put on to screen. I think is also you can just play around with what a character's feeling and how like open they feel about things. So I guess like earlier in the season where Mercy is with David, he you can see that like she feels comfortable, so she's in those areas of bigger space with him, but then when you feel like the walls are closing in on her and like the lie that she's living, you're more in her apartment and in those areas where it's just so tight and she kind of feels like more trapped in a prison in a way. And I do love that sort of visual style of it all and noticing those sort of things and how the use of space and how it's captured is just so it's interesting to see and very does get your mind flowing a bit more about how just how people are living and how you're even though a character might say they're fine, but how you're presenting it on screen in a different sort of way as well. It's just chef's kiss, should I say?
Yeah, that relates to Margaret and Hillary. I mean, that's what I felt like the first time I read the script. Like, it's all these women that are just trying to have control over their lives, and it's in a very like tense, in a very desperate way, because they know that if they let go, they'll just get lost in misery, like in their situation. And so that's why Margaret and Hillary's apartment, it has this space that you were talking about. It just gives that space to for it to make it more restrained, and there is a maybe a little bit of performating nature on it of like they need to keep pretending that everything is okay and in front of like the family, the staff, the co-workers, and instead Mercy, even though is in a similar situation, we are able to have a more intimate relationship with her because she's alone most of the time, and we're able to just see her vulnerability in more cases.
As a cinematographer as well, because you're capturing a lot of intimate moments in the show. If it's a case of people discussing about their life choices, or talking about their children being, or like Gus being missing and how family are moving from that. And you kind of see their characters at their most vulnerable. As a cinematographer, like how do you go about capturing those performances without getting in their way? Especially when you're in locations that are so tight and I don't feel like you want to get in the way as much.
Mm-hmm. Like the general approach, as I was saying, it's a little bit more distant, and as it progresses, there's scenes in which they kind of lose it, and the camera also gets more intimate, as you're saying. And those scenes were treated in a very different way because most, like generally speaking, Lulu and I, we shot list in a very specific way. So there's no coverage, and there's very specific directions and blocking and coverage. So there's no room a lot of times. I mean, some things always change, but there's not a lot of room for improvisation in most of the way we approach the project. But then in these scenes, it's the opposite. And in these scenes, it's a very big, loose shot list, and we leave a lot of room to the actors to just move in the space, and I just react. Like most of those scenes are also handheld, so that I can just react to whatever they do, and then actually it is true that most of those scenes were in tight spaces, and then I try not to have any gear on the ground, no stands. Like of course there's lights, but either I try to light from outside if possible or from above, so that they don't have those sort of restrictions. and we just come, like, it's just me in the room, sometimes Lulu just with a handheld monitor in a corner or inside a tiny bathroom, and that's it. So that, as you said, we are not on the way of that performance. And those are some of my favorite scenes to shoot. It's very thrilling, the energy that you get from the performances. So it's nice to contrast with this more restrained and control approach.
It's interesting how you like the use of the word thrilling to shoot these scenes, because it's usually, I guess it's like when you're capturing those sort of scenes, they're always the ones where either like as a cinematographer or people watching it on the monitor or through the eyepiece, it would be the ones that you might have a tear in your eye or be quite getting emotional about it because it's a very sort of heavy subject matter or things where you're a fly on the wall in what people are saying. And yeah, I like the description of it being thrilling because it is a case of seeing what's happening and capturing that and probably finding a way in how to shoot in these certain areas and also how you're saying you're lighting the scene, that is important, that it's not going to get in the way, but then you do it in a specific way to make sure that it's all perfect.
Yeah, sometimes in this case, I get very excited and then I want to do it over and over again, and I need to control myself because
Yeah, and I can see why you'd get that because it's just so. I guess it's just you're watching a masterclass in acting and performances and really people getting into the nitty-gritty of the story. I know it's
Mhm.
probably like different to an action sequence, for example, where action sequence, a lot of it probably is built in the edit rather than what's being shot because
Becomes technical. Yeah.
yeah, it's more just we need to make sure that in this car chase we get the looping crane shot of them going down the highway and then cut to this place, cut to that part. So we make sure that we got all the shots. But then here you just have that more of a intimate feel of like, wow, this is like you're seeing someone act their chops off, and it's just like, well, let's go again. Let's keep going. I want to selfishly keep seeing this and keep capturing it and keep building on what the energy and creativity is happening right now in front of us. And I guess as well, that's why like certain dramas are always like people have so much fun shooting them because they can see magic happening in front of them.
Yeah. I mean, I was just thinking as you were saying this, if you make me choose between a techno crane with all these amazing, I don't know, tools, or a tiny room with handheld camera, I'll probably take the handheld. In where I'm gonna be more happy and more um yeah, expressive.
So there's going to be a slight tangent, but when you have a choice between the two, why would you choose the handheld over the Technocrane? Is that because it's more, even though I know Technocrane will have a bit more specialists used to it, but with the handheld, is that more so that you can be in the trenches more to be involved?
Yeah, I mean, now I was just being an extreme, but it depends obviously on what part of the story, what film, like, or what project. I just think definitely what you're saying. It relates. You're more emotionally related to what's happening, and with that, it doesn't mean I love also like very objective and distant camera work. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that only enjoying that style, but yeah, I just feel I'm not drawn into these big movements or very like fancy camera movements because I that's not what I think of when I read a script or when I relating to a story. I I'm sure like there's material that calls for that, but that is not my first instinct or reaction to the material.
Okay. Yeah, I guess it's like the sort of beauty of each cinematographer project is that everybody's going to have their own interpretation of how they're going to capture the scene. And that's what I quite love about sort of creatives and the idea of like having a one scene is like, how would you shoot this? And each person would do it slightly differently, or there might be one or two elements that would be the same. If it's like a conversation between two people. But then going to episode 5 of the show, there's like a slight visual tonal change, which I would think that usually if you're watching a show it would take you out of it. But in this case it didn't. I felt like it was you were seeing like a different side of Hong Kong in terms of how much more sort of brighter color there is amongst what you're seeing in the crowds, in the rain. When it came to this episode, like how did you go about crafting the look for it, and why did you want to make it look so different?
Actually, this is related to the crane that we were just talking about, because in the intro, we did use some cranes, and that was obviously very purposely, because 5 needed to feel bigger. So in that's when that tool was the perfect tool to bring this epic tone, a little bit more of an epic tone to the story and the scope of the episode. Lulu always had the idea that the episode 5 was going to be a movie on its own, and it needed to have this, it needed to feel a standalone and a separate entity inside the same parameters as you were saying. So not going too far, staying in the same world, but making it distinct. And one of the things we did was change aspect ratio. So the rest of the show is 185, and episode 5 is shown on widescreen, and it's just a little detail to accentuate and to the different treatment, and to kind of, it's a little bit of a gesture of recognition and respect to all those characters, because that's what's happening. Like the secondary characters become the main characters. And for example, I think Margaret doesn't appear until minute 40. So it's just this respect to the characters that are taking now the spotlight, and to their stories. And then the other thing that was obviously very interesting about this episode is that it allows you to change perspective, and to, for example, enter the spaces literally from a different door, like the apartments that you've already seen for a few episodes, Hillary's and Margaret, and you're hopefully familiar with the spaces. Suddenly you enter through the back door, and you are surprised by this new part of the house that you actually didn't know it existed.
I think again, going to that technical side with like the crane swooping in, changing to different sort of shooting style in terms of like aspect ratio. I think as well, like as audience members, it's very, oh, how can I put it? It's like sometimes it can be sort of daunting to see because you're used to seeing how one thing is and then something else is like a different way. I think my mum brought up like something where she asked the questions while I was watching a show where they had the aspect ratio slightly smaller so that you get the two black lines at the top and the bottom. I don't know what it's called from the top of my head, so apologies if somebody's screaming that it's a certain thing. And it's always kind of interesting to hear from people who don't work in the industry and don't know about these certain things. So when it does happen or something does change, how jarring or how seamless it can be. I think with this, I think I knew straight away what you guys were going for. So it made it ease for me to go into the episode. And then it's the change of visual style. I found it quite gorgeous because you get something completely different. And as you said as well, you're changing character perspective and making others in like main characters and seeing the world how they would see them or how their world is compared to the people that they work for with the expats. And I just do like it how you do get a whole different vibe and look and feel, and even with like the colors being brighter and a whole different sort of atmosphere captured. But then I also sort of want to, you've mentioned as well, working with the production designer before on the farewell, but what is the collaboration like with all the other departments. Because like, how do you go about working together to make sure like that the look and the locations were right for the show? So also working with the costume design and set decorating so that you don't all clash with one another in terms of different sort of color palettes and ideas.
As I mentioned before, we are very close collaborators with Young. It's very easy for us to work together. We've done a bunch of projects, so it's very easy to be on the same page. And then Malgosia, which was costume designer, she was new to the team. It was the first time collaborating with her. But we just connected right away. Like I remember she came out of quarantine, again, 3 weeks. So plenty of time for her to draw sketches, and she came these beautiful sketches with all the character's arc and a lot of concepts to discuss. So we just spent a lot of time talking about it. Color palette was very specific, as you were saying, because Lulu and I, we shortlist in very specific, and we shortlist in location as much as possible. So we spend a lot of time in all these places. And once we finish, at the end of the day, we usually have like a huge list of things to discuss with Young, of like this window, like a lot of details. And I take stills and record videos. I have Lulu playing all the characters of the show. So one day I always joke that I want to edit the show with her performance because she's very good. And then I share with them. So they have a lot of information, and they can we can just discuss it and be very specific in all the decisions with all the departments.
It's funny when you're mentioning about Lulu playing all the characters. It feels like if you edit it together, it'd kind of be like an Eddie Murphy movie.
It's
Um,
hilarious. Yes. I have the farewell too. I can edit Expats and the farewell with.
we're like, you know, when they say that, you know, releasing the director's cut, and be like, now we got the cinematographer's cut. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
we should make that a thing now. But also when you're storyboarding and getting shots sort of lined up on your recce's, I guess as like designers and set decorators, you can see how you're going to use the space and what's going to be in shot and what's not going to be in shots.
Exactly.
Um, and I think that's quite, I don't know, I think that's quite a good way of when you're looking at it as a designer to say, oh, okay, if we've got this sort of dead space here, maybe we can fill it with certain things that says about the character, or we actually have nothing really there in the background. Will the how what would be the shallow depth of focus in the back? But if it's quite shallow, then we don't need to worry about it as much.
Yeah, and prioritize the spaces that are going to be seen more in camera. Like you want to make sure that the details of that explain your character or whatever depth are in those walls or that background, that it's going to be more showcased.
Yes, and I guess with lots of things being shot on location, it's probably a task for people to sort of work round to what's going to be needed to be used and how it's going to be presented as well. Because even if you have used the location, you don't want to what's the word? Spoil it too much by jumping in and doing too much on it. But again, that's part and parcel of filming, that there will be things that you will need to move around. Just to hit you up with my penultimate question, what was your hardest scene to shoot?
I don't know if I have a lot of them were hard, but I would say the most challenging was episode 5 because of the rain. Obviously, some of the exteriors, but definitely the exteriors, because I don't think in any of the days that we shot episode 5 rain, there was real rain, none of them. So it had to be very well planned, and the time of the days were very specific, and a lot of times because of the restrictions, we would have to shoot the scene in a very short window when the sun was low enough that wouldn't, affect the background, and then we would just rehearse a bunch of times and have everything as mapped as possible, and then have like sometimes like 20-30 minutes to shoot the scene. And that was very stressful, and a lot of times it was like, no, this is not going to be like, there were a lot of concerns, obviously, because it's a lot of things that can go wrong, and then you've lost a half day or a whole day. We never did. It always worked, but obviously it came with the pressure, the stress. And also we shot the show, on the entire show, during COVID, and Hong Kong had very hard and strict mandatories. So the masks were mandatories in the street. And so it wasn't like, I wish it was now that you can just go out on a rainy day and shoot a bunch of shots, beautiful shots of the city, but we couldn't, because then there would be masks everywhere. So every single exterior shot of the show has had to be planned, locked down, and filled with extras, because of the masks. So that made the episode 5 a challenge.
When you're shooting with rain, it's never probably it's not ideal, is it really? Just because there is a lot that you probably have to take into consideration, and also the idea of how you're lighting scenes and what's going on, and probably resetting as well. But then also, as you said, like how you have to rely on the weather to make sure that you can get through your day, and how, like, I can imagine that being quite stressful, being there at the time, knowing that you're like, okay, if this doesn't happen, then we might not be able to shoot. We'll be losing a day here. We might be doing this. We might be doing that. It's funny when I do hear these sort of stories about relying on weather, is the amount of luck people have that in the end it somehow works out perfectly, and you manage to do all your days, and manage to get what you need to get as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just a result of a lot of hard work from everybody, and luckily you do make your day.
But I think it's funny as well as like the amount of probably apps that everybody downloads to check on weathers and
I
what
have like 5 different weather apps.
Yeah, and then you're just thinking like everybody's just constantly checking. It's like, are we ready? We're ready. Yeah, let's go, let's go. Or like even the weather reports that people probably paid for as well. But that is the magic of filmmaking that people do not realize that goes into it, and the planning, the meticulousness of it to make sure that it's all goes to plan basically.
Just wanted to mention, because the special effects team did an incredible job, obviously, with the rain. It wasn't easy because Hong Kong has a lot of restrictions, so they don't, it's, as I said, it's very dense city, so they don't give you permits for any lifts or condors or anything. So they had to manage and come up with solutions like jerry rigs and like whatever they could come up with in order to make it happen. The same with my G&E team. Like, we couldn't light a lot of the scenes through from outside because we couldn't get permits. So they had to come up with all these crazy solutions.
I think as well, like that's another headache that must come into that comes into play, is that idea of the permits, the restrictions. Like shooting a film and TV show normally is difficult as it is, but then if it's under all these strict COVID rules and other restrictions, then it must be such a headache for people who are scheduling it and realizing that you can only be in certain places for certain times, or that you need to be doing this or XYZ. That's another thing that you should say, like hats off to yourself and the rest of the team on the show, to
Absolutely.
being able to navigate that. Then also, it's not even navigating it, it's like keeping to the rules as well, because like imagine if you break it, then people are going to get fined, people might get lose their jobs, people might even get kicked out of the country. Like all these little sort of variables that need to be taken into consideration. And just to hit you with my final question, what was your favorite scene to shoot?
I have one of my dearest memories was shooting Margaret's secret apartment, which is this tiny apartment on a seventh floor walk up. It's a real location, and it was already tiny, but Young made it still like even more tiny. She built this wall to make it more claustrophobic and intimate, but also to hide our crew, like the people that needed to be close by, like first AC, and then that made it possible that in the room it ended up being just 4 women. We always romanticize this moment. It was the first day that we shot with Nicole, and it was my first time working with such a big name, big star, and so I was quite nervous. So even though I met her before, it's still Nicole Kidman there. And we were suddenly in this tiny room, only 4 women. Her, like, she was an actual, like, almost naked, in the bathtub, and very intimate setup. Her hair and makeup person, Noriko, was just there to adjust. And it was me operating, and Lulu in a corner with her handheld monitor. And it just was very, that's where I feel comfortable in these small setups. And it just it felt very intimate and almost very liberating, like as it just felt like an indie production, even though we were obviously not in one, and there were a bunch of trucks downstairs, but that was our tiny bubble. And we shot there like I think 2 days, or 3 days, and there's a bunch of the scenes that they didn't make it to in the cut, but they're some of my favorite for sure.
I guess when you have those moments on set, so even though you're working with certain actors, and as you say, you might meet them before, and then you actually go on set, you get nervous. I think that probably comes down to um, it's always going to be one of those things, right? It's not like you get starstruck. It's just one of those things where you're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to be shooting Nicole Kidman today. This is going to be, insane. Wow. But then also, as you said, when there's only 4 of you there on set, and how intimate that shooting must have been like, and sort of being one of the first people to watch those performances as well, because that's the time as audience members, you see Nicole Kidman sort of be herself as a character. She's very much like shut away from the world, and she can have her time to be herself rather than still being like the mother dotting around and then dealing with everything that's going on. Kids shouting, Clark might not be there, the husband, and it all can get too much. But whilst there, you see the real her and the real sort of character side of her.
Mm-hmm.
But again, solid choice, and it's a very good sort of like, yeah, that's a really good choice as well. And also, it's a shame that they cut some scenes out as well, but such as the editing process of a TV show and a film.
Yeah, that's how it works. Sometimes some of your favorite babies go away, like you're taking away. So
Yes, and it's always like, in a way, it's always a bit of a shame because you think, oh, if only we just kept this a little bit or had this in it. But again, that's how editors, they make those decisions, and they make those difficult decisions to make sure that the episode flows, even if they do have to take out your babies.
yeah.
Anna, thank you so much for your time today. Expats is streaming now on Amazon Prime. Go out and watch Anna and her team and the rest of the crew's excellent work. Enjoy it and savor it. Thank you again, Anna.
Thank you, Rob. It's great talking to you.
Thank you very much. You take care, and bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast.